Sarah Mitchell hadn't been to a wedding in 3 years, not since her own marriage had dissolved in a lawyer's office on the 14th floor of a downtown Chicago building she still avoided passing. She stood now in the ballroom of the Renaissance Hotel, 20 miles outside the city, watching her college roommate Lauren marry a man who owned a chain of car dealerships across the Midwest. The reception was elegant, without being ostentatious. The kind of event where people who had done well for themselves gathered to celebrate without making a show of it. Sarah had almost declined the invitation. Money was tight, impossibly tight, and the dress she wore was the same navy blue one she had purchased for job interviews 2 years ago, when the marketing firm where she had worked for 8 years had eliminated her position during restructuring. She had sewn new buttons on it and convinced herself it looked different enough that no one would remember seeing it before. The real reason she had almost stayed home had nothing to do with the dress. David would be here. Lauren had warned her gently over coffee 3 weeks earlier, suggesting that perhaps Sarah might want to bring someone, but Sarah had no one to bring. David, her ex-husband, would undoubtedly arrive with Melissa, the 26-year-old dental hygienist he had left Sarah for 18 months into their marriage. Sarah had told Lauren it was fine, that she was over it, that seeing David wouldn't bother her. She had been lying. Now, standing near the bar with a glass of white wine she was nursing to make it last, Sarah spotted them across the room. David looked exactly as he always had, pleasant and forgettable in a grey suit that probably came from the same department store where he had always shopped. Melissa wore red, a bold choice that drew attention, her hand resting possessively on David's arm as they moved through the crowd, greeting people Sarah recognized from her own past. The humiliation she had thought she had processed came flooding back, not because she still loved David, she had realized months ago that she probably never had, but because seeing them together reminded her of how completely her life had unraveled. The divorce had been expensive. David had contested everything, despite having been the one to leave, and Sarah's lawyer fees had consumed what little savings she had managed to build. Her mother's medical bills from the final 6 months of her battle with cancer had taken the rest. Sarah was 34 years old, living in a studio apartment in a neighborhood that made her uncomfortable walking home after dark, working 3 part-time jobs that together barely covered her rent and student loans. She had a master's degree in marketing and couldn't get a call back for positions she was overqualified for. She was considering leaving early, fabricating a headache, or early morning obligation, when she felt someone watching her. Sarah had developed an instinct for this over the past year, the awareness of being observed that came from months of job interviews and uncomfortable interactions with landlords and bill collectors who looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She turned slightly and found herself meeting the gaze of a man standing alone near the windows overlooking the garden. He was older than most of the guests, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, with grey threading through dark hair and the kind of face that suggested he smiled infrequently, but genuinely when he did. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that made every other man in the room look slightly rumpled by comparison. When their eyes met, he didn't look away with the embarrassment of being caught staring. Instead, he raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement and moved toward her with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never questioned whether his presence was welcome. Sarah felt a flutter of panic, unprepared for conversation with a stranger, but he was already beside her before she could retreat. He didn't speak immediately, just stood next to her, looking out at the same crowd she had been observing, as if they were both spectators at an event neither fully belonged to. Finally, he said, "Weddings always make me wonder about the stories we don't see. Everyone here is performing some version of happiness, but you can tell who's genuinely glad to be here and who's fulfilling an obligation." His voice was quiet, meant only for her, with a slight roughness that suggested he didn't waste words on small talk. Sarah glanced at him, surprised by the observation. She had expected a pickup line or unwanted flirtation, not philosophical commentary. Are you fulfilling an obligation? She asked, the question coming out before she could stop herself. He considered this seriously. The groom's father and I went to college together. Haven't seen Richard in probably 15 years, but he called personally to invite me. So yes, obligation mixed with genuine affection for someone I used to know. And you? Sarah hesitated. The bride was my roommate freshman year. We've stayed close, even though our lives went different directions. The man nodded, seeming to understand what she hadn't said, that Lauren's life had ascended while Sarah's had contracted. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Sarah saw David and Melissa moving in their direction. David had spotted her. She could tell by the way his eyes widened slightly and the way Melissa's grip on his arm tightened. They were going to come over. David would introduce Melissa with that apologetic smile he always used when he was about to do something uncomfortable, and Sarah would have to stand there pretending to be gracious while dying inside. The desperation hit her suddenly, overwhelmingly. She turned to the stranger beside her and spoke before she could think better of it. I know this is going to sound insane, but would you do me a favor? Could you dance with me? My ex-husband is walking this way, and I just can't stand here and make polite conversation with him and his girlfriend right now. The man looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment at the absurdity of what she had just asked a complete stranger. She was about to apologize to tell him to forget it when he set down his glass and extended his hand. Of course, he said simply, as if she had asked him something perfectly reasonable. She took his hand, startled by how natural it felt, and let him guide her toward the dance floor where other couples were moving to something slow and classical. His hand settled at the small of her back with a respectful firmness, and they began to move together. Sarah was intensely aware of how close they were, of the subtle scent of expensive cologne, of the way he led with an easy competence that suggested he had done this many times before. I should probably know your name if I'm using you as a human shield, Sarah said, attempting lightness to cover her mortification. He smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him. James, he offered. James Whitfield. And you're Sarah. I heard the bride mention you earlier. Sarah felt herself relax fractionally. Thank you for this. I know it's ridiculous, but seeing him with her, it's not that I want him back. I don't. But it's just... You don't have to explain, James interrupted gently. Sometimes we need to protect ourselves from situations that hurt even when they shouldn't anymore. They continued dancing, and Sarah found herself studying his face more closely. There was something about him that seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. He had the kind of presence that suggested authority, the way he held himself, the way other guests glanced at him with what looked like recognition or respect. Are you in Richard's business? She asked, trying to place him. James' expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I'm in finance, corporate restructuring mostly. The words were deliberately vague. Sarah recognized the tone from her own attempts to downplay difficult topics at social gatherings. The song ended and another began, but James didn't release her. If you don't mind, he said, I'd prefer to keep dancing. The alternative is making conversation with Richard's business associates, and I've spent enough of my life in rooms full of people talking about market projections and acquisition strategies. Sarah couldn't help but smile. That sounds soul-crushing. It can be, James agreed, though I've learned that everything is soul-crushing if you let it become the only thing you do. There's wisdom in that, Sarah said, thinking of how her own identity had become so wrapped up in career success that losing her job had felt like losing herself. They danced through 2 more songs, and Sarah realized she had completely forgotten about David. When she finally glanced around the room, she saw him and Melissa seated at a table on the far side, David's expression confused as he watched Sarah with James. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying James's company in a way that had nothing to do with avoiding her ex-husband. He was intelligent without being condescending, asking her questions that seemed designed to understand her rather than impress her with his own knowledge. When she mentioned her background in marketing, he listened with real attention as she described the campaigns she had developed for mid-sized companies, the satisfaction of seeing her strategies succeed. She didn't mention that she hadn't worked in her field in 2 years, and he didn't press for details about her current situation. They had moved from the dance floor to a quieter corner of the terrace, the November air cool, but not uncomfortable. Sarah had borrowed his suit jacket when she shivered, and now stood wrapped in fabric that probably cost more than her monthly rent, breathing in the faint scent of him and feeling something she hadn't felt in years, the possibility that maybe her life wasn't permanently broken. James was telling her about a cabin he owned in northern Wisconsin, a place he escaped to when the pressures of his work became too much. "It's nothing fancy," he said. "Just a small place on a lake where I can think without phones ringing or people needing decisions. I go fishing even though I'm terrible at it, and I've learned to appreciate silence in a way I never did when I was younger." Sarah smiled at the image of this clearly successful man sitting alone by a lake with a fishing rod. "That sounds perfect," she said sincerely. "I can't remember the last time I had real silence. I'm always moving between jobs or worrying about bills or trying to figure out what comes next." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, revealing more than she had intended about the precariousness of her situation. James regarded her thoughtfully. "What would you do if you weren't worried about what comes next? If you could just be still for a moment and figure out what you actually want?" No one had asked Sarah that question in longer than she could remember. Everyone wanted to know her plans, her strategy for getting back on track, as if life were a highway she had accidentally exited and needed to merge back onto. But what did she want? The question felt almost dangerous in its simplicity. "I think I'd want to do work that matters," she said slowly. "Not just campaigns to sell products people don't need, but something that actually helps people or solves real problems. And I'd want to feel like my life was mine again, not something I'm constantly defending or explaining or apologizing for." James nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Those seem like reasonable things to want." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying an edge of bitterness. "Wanting them and having them are very different things, though." "Money changes what's possible," James observed quietly. "But it doesn't change what matters. I've known plenty of wealthy people who are completely lost, and I've known people with almost nothing who understand exactly who they are and what they value. The question is never really about money. It's about whether you're living in alignment with what you believe is important." Before Sarah could respond, Lauren appeared on the terrace, slightly flushed from dancing and clearly delighted to find Sarah still at the reception. "I've been looking for you," she said, then noticed James and her eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Whitfield, I didn't realize you and Sarah knew each other." "We just met tonight," James said smoothly. "Sarah was kind enough to keep me company when I was contemplating an early escape." Lauren looked between them with poorly concealed curiosity. "Well, I'm glad you both stayed. Sarah, I wanted to introduce you to someone from Marcus's firm who's looking for a marketing consultant. I immediately thought of you." She gestured toward the ballroom, where a man in his 50s stood talking with the groom. Sarah felt a familiar anxiety tighten in her chest. Lauren had been trying to help her network for months, arranging introductions that never quite led anywhere, always with the best intentions, but without understanding how exhausting it was to perform competence while feeling like a charity case. "That's very kind of you," Sarah said, forcing warmth into her voice. Lauren squeezed her arm affectionately. "Come on, I'll introduce you now before he leaves." She glanced at James. "You don't mind if I steal her for a few minutes?" Not at all, James said, and Sarah thought she detected something understanding in his expression as she allowed Lauren to guide her back inside. The introduction was as awkward as Sarah had feared. The man, Gerald something, accepted her business card with the polite disinterest of someone fulfilling a social obligation to the bride. He asked a few perfunctory questions about her experience, clearly already mentally filing her away as someone to follow up with never, and excused himself as soon as it was socially acceptable. Sarah felt the familiar weight of rejection settling over her shoulders. When she turned around, James was gone. She scanned the ballroom but couldn't find him anywhere and realized with a sinking feeling that he must have left. Of course he had. Their conversation had been pleasant, but ultimately meaningless, just a distraction for both of them at an event neither had wanted to attend. Sarah collected her coat and called for a ride-share, the cost making her wince, but the alternative of waiting for the bus at this hour feeling too depressing to contemplate. As she stood outside waiting, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "It was good to meet you tonight, Sarah. If you're serious about finding work that matters, I might have an opportunity you'd be interested in. No pressure, just a conversation if you want it." The message included a phone number and was signed simply with the initial J. Sarah stared at the screen, a dozen warnings flooding her mind. She didn't really know this man. His offer could be anything from legitimate to predatory. Every instinct developed from 2 years of disappointment told her to be cautious, to protect herself, to assume the worst because hoping for better had only ever led to being let down. But there was something in the memory of their conversation that felt different from all the other networking attempts and awkward introductions. James had listened to her not as a project to fix or a connection to exploit, but as a person whose thoughts were worth hearing. That alone felt rare enough to be worth the risk of a conversation. The following Tuesday, Sarah found herself in the lobby of a downtown building she had passed hundreds of times without really noticing. The address James had provided led to the headquarters of Whitfield Capital, a name she had vaguely recognized, but hadn't connected to the man she had met at the wedding. A quick internet search the night before had revealed exactly who James Whitfield was, a venture capitalist worth somewhere in the range of several $billion, known for funding companies focused on social impact and sustainability. Sarah had nearly cancelled the meeting 3 times, convinced this had to be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. But something had kept her from backing out, perhaps the same reckless impulse that had made her ask a stranger to dance, the desperate need to believe that maybe, possibly, something could change. The receptionist directed her to the 23rd floor, where a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an efficient manner introduced herself as Patricia, James's executive assistant. "He's just finishing a call," Patricia said, gesturing toward a seating area with a view of the Chicago River. "Can I get you anything while you wait?" Sarah shook her head, too nervous to trust herself with coffee or water. She smoothed her dress, the same navy blue one from the wedding, and tried to calm the anxiety making her hands tremble slightly. What was she even doing here? This wasn't how life worked, not her life anyway. People didn't meet billionaires at weddings and get offered mysterious opportunities. This had to be some kind of elaborate setup for disappointment. The door to the inner office opened and James emerged, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and no tie, looking somehow both more casual and more intimidating than he had at the wedding. "Sarah," he greeted her with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "Thank you for coming. Please come in." His office was large but surprisingly understated, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows and furnished with pieces that looked comfortable rather than designed to impress. Sarah noticed several photographs on a bookshelf, James with what appeared to be his adult children. James shaking hands with people she vaguely recognized as politicians or business leaders. James standing in front of what looked like a newly constructed school building somewhere rural. He gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk and took the other, rather than positioning himself behind the desk, creating a sense of conversation rather than interview. "I'm sure you looked me up after I sent that message," he said with a slight smile, "and I'm sure you're wondering what exactly I'm doing inviting you here." Sarah decided honesty was her best option. "The thought crossed my mind," she admitted. James nodded appreciatively. "Fair enough. Let me be direct then. I wasn't exaggerating at the wedding when I said I spend too much time around people talking about market projections. What I do, what my firm does, is invest in companies trying to solve actual problems: clean energy, affordable housing, accessible healthcare, education technology. We fund businesses that can be profitable while also making a measurable positive impact." "That sounds admirable," Sarah said carefully, still not understanding where she fit into this. "It's also complicated," James continued, "because you need people who understand both the business side and the human side. People who can communicate why these ventures matter in ways that resonate with investors who are used to thinking purely in terms of returns. I need someone who can tell stories that make people care, who can translate mission into messaging without it feeling manipulative or empty. I think you might be that person." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. Based on one conversation at a wedding? "Based on the way you talked about wanting to do work that matters," James said. "Based on the fact that you've clearly been through some difficult circumstances, but you haven't become cynical or bitter. Based on instinct, which I've learned to trust over the years." He slid a folder across the small table between them. "This is an overview of what the position would entail. Director of Impact Communication. You'd work directly with our portfolio companies to develop campaigns, messaging strategies, content that helps them connect with their audiences and their investors. It's challenging work, and I won't pretend it's not demanding, but it's also the kind of work where you can see the results of what you do making a real difference." Sarah opened the folder, scanning the job description and feeling increasingly overwhelmed. The salary listed was nearly double what she had made at her previous job. The benefits were comprehensive in ways she had forgotten were possible. It seemed too good to be true, which in her experience meant it probably was. "Why me?" she asked bluntly, looking up to meet his eyes. "You could hire someone with more recent experience, someone who hasn't been struggling to find work for 2 years. "Who says I haven't tried?" James replied calmly. "I've interviewed a dozen candidates over the past 6 months. They all had impressive resumes and said the right things, but none of them understood what I'm actually trying to accomplish here. They saw it as a job, not a calling. You understand the difference?" Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to believe that this opportunity was real and that she deserved it. But years of rejection and disappointment had built walls that were hard to dismantle. "I need to think about it," she heard herself saying. "Of course," James said immediately. "Take whatever time you need. But Sarah, I want you to know this isn't charity and it's not pity. This is a genuine offer based on my belief that you're the right person for what I'm trying to build here. If you take this job, I'll expect excellent work. I'll expect you to challenge me when you think I'm wrong. I'll expect you to care as much about the mission as I do." Sarah left the building an hour later with the folder under her arm and her mind spinning. She walked along the river instead of heading directly to the train, needing time to process what had just happened. Part of her still insisted this had to be some kind of trick, but a smaller, quieter part was beginning to wonder if maybe, possibly, she was being offered exactly what she had told James she wanted: a chance to do work that mattered, to feel like her life was hers again. 3 days later, Sarah called the number James had given her. When Patricia answered, Sarah took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. Tell Mr. Whitfield I accept his offer. 6 months into the position, Sarah stood in a conference room presenting a campaign strategy to investors interested in one of Whitfield Capital's education technology companies. She watched their expressions shift from polite attention to genuine engagement as she explained how the product could change outcomes for students in underfunded school districts. When the meeting ended and several investors committed to additional funding, James caught her eye across the room and nodded with what looked like pride. Later, in his office, he told her that her work over the past months had exceeded even his optimistic expectations. "You were right," she said, thinking back to that conversation on the terrace at Lauren's wedding, about what matters versus what's possible. Turns out they aren't as separate as I thought they were. James smiled, and Sarah realized it was the same rare, genuine smile she had seen that first night. "I had a feeling you'd figure that out." Sarah didn't know if she believed in fate or destiny or any of the things that suggested the universe had a plan. But standing there, doing work she cared about, finally feeling like her life made sense again, she thought maybe sometimes the right stranger appears at the right moment, not to rescue you, but to remind you that transformation is possible if you're brave enough to believe you deserve it. The dance they had shared that night had been brief, a moment of protective kindness between two people who didn't know each other. What came after had nothing to do with romance or rescue, and everything to do with recognition, someone seeing potential where she had learned to see only failure, someone offering opportunity where she had expected only more closed doors. Sometimes, Sarah would think later, the most important encounters in our lives don't announce themselves as life-changing. They feel small and ordinary in the moment. A conversation at a wedding, a dance to avoid an ex-husband, a business card exchanged. It's only later, when you look back from the other side of transformation, that you understand how much can change when someone believes in you before you believe in yourself. Not because they want to save you, but because they recognize something true about who you are and who you could become. That recognition, that simple act of seeing someone clearly and offering them a chance to rise, that might be the most valuable gift one person can give another. Not money, not connections, not even opportunity by itself, but the reminder that your story isn't over, that the next chapter can be different from the last, that sometimes the courage to accept help is the same as the courage to finally believe you deserve better. And maybe that's all any of us really need. Someone to believe in us just long enough for us to remember how to believe in ourselves.